Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse for our webinar today. Today we're going to be talking about managing speeds in work zones. Hi, I'm Brad Sant, Vice President of Safety and Education for the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. Today we're pleased to have with us Melissa Finley from the Texas Transportation Institute. Now, Melissa has 13 years with TTI, and in that capacity has served in a number of senior positions, including principal investigator on numerous research studies on work zones, traffic control devices, traffic control operations, and human factors. Currently, Melissa serves on a number of technical committees, including those with TRB, ITE, and others. So today, Melissa is going to provide us some information that we would consider for reducing speeds, regulatory speeds in work zones, and considering things such as speed limit management strategies and the utilization of speed reduction strategies. During our broadcast, you'll see on your screen a box where you can send in questions. You can send them in at any time, and after Melissa's presentation, she will take those questions in the order they're received. Also, you'll note that you can receive professional development hours for participation in today's webinar. So you can go to the WorkZone Safety Information Clearinghouse, that's www.workzonesafety.org, to receive more information on how you can receive those professional development hours. So now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Melissa. Melissa?
Thanks, Brad. We'll go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to talk about some guidelines that were developed with TTI and some other people through the FHWA Work Zone Safety Grant Program. And I'm also going to bring in some data for some research projects in Texas to kind of highlight some of the reasons that we've provided some of this information and guidance. At the end of the presentation, I'll tell you where you can find this guidance document, as well as some other upcoming documents that you might be interested in on the Work Zone Safety Clearinghouse website. So first of all, one of the fundamental principles of temporary traffic control is to inhibit the road user's movement as little as possible. However, for safety concerns, there are certain times when we would like to reduce the speed limit in work zones. One of those would be when workers are exposed to moving traffic without positive protection, and when there may be roadway restrictions or other work hazards that necessitate a reduced speed for motorists. However, getting motorists to actually slow down is not an easy task, nor is it inexpensive. What are some benefits of slower speeds? Well, obviously, we all know that if we have a crash at a lower speed, the severity of that crash is reduced, as well as the injuries that are sustained. Going slower also improves a driver's ability to control that vehicle, especially if it was to kind of go out of control, and then they would have more time to react when that happens, and they would have less stopping distance if they were going slower. Slower speeds also provide more time for a worker to escape. So if we do have a car that gets out of control and intrudes into a work zone, the worker may have more time to hear that car, acknowledge that car, and move out of the way so maybe there isn't an injury. Slower speeds also reduce wind effects from large trucks that may be passing the work zone. So we have all of these positive benefits of slower speeds, yet there are still some concerns with reducing speeds in work zones. Not only do we have to worry about just the speeds that are going through, but another important factor is the speed variance, or the differential between speeds of the vehicles traveling through the work zone. If we increase that speed variance, so maybe some cars are going slow, some cars are going fast, that actually can increase the crash risk as well. Also, non-uniform speeds like that increase conflicts between vehicles, which can then also reduce some roadway capacity and cause some issues with crashes. Reduces in roadway capacity also can lead to localized congestion in areas in your work zone, and if that congestion builds, especially if it were to get outside of the limits of the signs for the work zone, we can actually increase the potential for rear-end crashes. And overall, there are just concerns that in some instances, if work zone speed limits are implemented, maybe if they're not necessarily needed to improve safety, they could decrease mobility. So with those two kind of balancing acts of some positives and some concerns, when are slower speeds actually needed in work zones? The guidance that we've put together suggests that we definitely need slower speeds if workers are exposed to traffic and they're not behind positive protection. So the times when workers are on foot, immediately adjacent to travel lanes that are active with only cones and barrels separating them, is a definite situation where you'd want to consider reducing the speed limits to increase worker safety. We also have such instances as roadway restrictions and different work operation situations that may increase the risk to road users, and we'd like them to slow down for those situations. Some are listed here, like temporary traffic control barrier or pavement edge drop-offs really close to the lane. We also have narrow lanes. Again, going slower allows the road user or motorist to control their vehicle more, and with less space to maneuver, that becomes important. We also might want them to slow down in lane closures or temporary crossovers because we have changed the geometry of the roadway that the motorist is traversing. And there may be unexpected conditions that are not readily apparent to motorists which also need reduced work zone speed limits, such as if there's been a crash history there of issues before that the work zone is causing. Also, sometimes access and egress of work trucks may not be apparent to every driver that's going by, but may need reduced speed for that as well. Also, if you're concerned about congestion. So if we decide that we need a reduced or work zone speed limit in a work zone, there's two ways to do that. A lot of times we'll reduce the work zone speed limit with a regulatory speed limit, and we just call those work zone speed limits. These inform the driver of the legal speed limit. Typically, these are reduced about 10 miles an hour from the existing posted speed limit. That is the suggested maximum reduction in the manual and uniform traffic control devices. However, engineering judgment can be used if there needs to be a larger increase due to some special conditions. Now, even though a maximum of 10 is recommended in the manual and uniform traffic control devices, you can only reduce the speed limit 5 miles an hour, and in some situations, that may be applicable. Now, work zone regulatory speed limits vary by state. Every state has different laws that may depend on how they can be implemented and for what situations they may be implemented for. Now, the other option we have is to go with more of an advisory speed limit in a localized area. So if you have a lane shift, and that's the location where you just need maybe a short segment of a speed limit reduction, you can post that as an advisory speed. These plaques are usually located below warning signs, and they tell the motorist that they should adapt to that speed for that certain section. Again, the use of advisory speed plaques is also established by DOT policies and standards. So, a couple of things that are important to remember when you're implementing reduced work zone speed limits. They need to be safe and reasonable for conditions. This is one of my favorite pictures on the screen of a work zone that may not be necessarily posted correctly. We see a large, open, expansive roadway ahead of us going off into the mountains, yet they are posting it at 30 miles an hour. A couple of things to point out. We need to put our work zone speed limits in the vicinity of the condition where workers are, work activity, or the restrictive feature, such as a lane closure or lane shift, so that we know what those work zone speed limits are for. They shouldn't necessarily be posted for the entire work zone. So let's say we have a 10-mile resurfacing project in a day where you're working and where the issues are for the hazards that necessitate the work zone speed limit. You have a 2-mile segment. Those work zone speed limits really need to be at the beginning of that 2-mile segment and at the throughout, and then posted back to the regulatory normal speed limit at the end. We don't necessarily need that reduced speed limit for the whole 10 miles. We also want to make sure we're only posting them when conditions warrant. Again, if you'll look at the picture, this might have been some kind of maintenance project during the day with a lot of work activity and equipment on the road. However, at this time of day, there's no evidence of work going on. There is, it's kind of hard to tell, but there is striping on the road. It is a 2-lane roadway with a shoulder, and there really doesn't seem to be a need for the reduced speed limit that's shown right now. So this is where we get into if the workers are gone, the equipment's gone, the hazard itself, whether it be geometric or the work activity, is gone. We really need to remove or cover the work zone speed limit signs so that the existing regulatory speed limit is put back in place. If we don't keep these things in mind and don't follow these simple principles, a couple of potential consequences might happen. First of all, we have a reduced credibility in speed limits. We don't want a motorist to be looking at a situation and looking at the speed limit and realizing they don't match, because that may tend then for them to ignore other work zone speed limits that really are needed. We also don't want decreased compliance with speed control and work zone devices. Again, you may have greater variation in speeds, which could cause an increase in crashes, and you may also have negative public opinion of the work zone and how the agency is serving the public. So in order to maintain credibility, we would suggest that your work zone reduced speed limits must match conditions. Again, make sure that what you are needing to reduce the speed for is in place and is apparent. And if it's not, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. When your reduced work zone speed limit is in effect, obviously it would be nice to enforce it. We're going to talk a little bit about law enforcement in a minute, as well as some other speed management techniques you may use when that's not available. Public relations campaigns can also be used to discuss the importance of reduced work zone speed limits and safety while you're traveling through work zones. Now, I want to bring back to the point that if we don't have a need for the work zone speed limit to be there, again, if your workers or work activity is the key and it's removed for the day and there's nothing else out there, no other hazard, we really need to be removing or covering those signs so that we can have the existing speed limit back in effect. Well, obviously that leads to some challenges, okay? If we are every day or during different weeks having to change our signs frequently, there are some concerns with that as well. It is difficult to do that and tedious. It also may interfere with normal traffic flow, which we are trying to keep mobile and for mobility purposes. And there are concerns that it exposes workers to other traffic hazards. We know that setting up and taking down traffic control is a critical part of worker safety, and that is a part that we need to be concerned about as well. So what are some other options that may be out there to help you change your signs more frequently? I show 3 here on the slide. One is a static speed limit sign with flashing beacons. Basically, it works like a school speed zone in the effect that when the beacons are flashing, your static speed limit that's shown on the board is in effect. Otherwise, if the beacons are not flashing, you can basically ignore that regulatory speed limit sign. Now, I will caution with all of these before I move forward that different state laws may hinder you from implementing these. You definitely need to check with your state DOT and state traffic laws before trying to implement them. For example, with the static speed limit sign with flashing beacons, we could not look at that one in Texas because Texas law actually states that work zone speed limits must be removed or covered. It does not give the option of this kind of technology or addition, even though it does give that option for school speed limits. So it's a little bit interesting that you have to make sure you're following your rules and regulations for your state. Now, another option is a roll-up speed limit sign, just like your typical warning signs that you may have on flexible material that you would post at a 1-foot mounting height for short duration or short-term stationary kind of situations. We worked with a manufacturer and developed a flexible speed limit sign for that, and that was approved to be used in Texas. We also used or have looked into variable speed limit signs. Now, variable speed limit signs can be stationary or semi-permanent, as we show here in the picture, or we also had some trailer-mounted ones that we used in a few work zones in Texas, and I'll talk about those in just a minute. So first of all, I want to talk about some short-term evaluations that we did in Texas. We did them with some static, typical regulatory speed limit signs that you would put up. We also used the flexible roll-up signs as well as some variable speed limit trailers. Now, all of these, the roll-up signs and the variable speed limit trailers, were really designed in mind to work with short-duration or short-term stationary operations, which at the time were not really able, the way that Texas law is written and the way you have to go to the commission to get reduced speed limits, to readily implement short-term work zone speed limits. We felt these devices would help with that. The variable speed limit trailer obviously just changes the numerals that are on there so you can go to whatever speed is necessary. And we did these with some seal coat projects that moved down the road. And in Texas, we do have some higher existing speed limits. In this case, they were on roads where the existing speed limit was 70 miles an hour, and it was reduced 10 miles an hour to 60. So what we found here at 2 sites, at one site where we're able to look at all 3 types of devices, and at the other site we were only able to look at the 2 kind of innovative products. What we saw upstream of the work zones was that the free flow speeds were very much the same across all of our conditions. And then downstream of the treatment, we did see a speed reduction for all of the treatments. It ranged from about 4 to 9 miles an hour. What you will see is that there was a significant reduction and difference between the standard speed limit signs that were used and the roll-up and variable speed limit signs. So our 2 innovative products actually reduced the speed more than the standard sign and also reduced the percent exceeding the speed limit downstream of the treatment more. Now, between the 2 innovative products, there really wasn't a statistical difference there. So we were looking at them being very comparable in how they decreased the mean speed and they decreased the percent of vehicles traveling or exceeding over the speed limit. So we thought these were very positive results for these innovative products. And we also did a long-term evaluation because there are several projects in Texas, like the one I'm about to describe to you. This was a 9-mile project where they were widening a 4-lane undivided roadway to a 4-lane divided roadway. Now, in this section, when they first started work and throughout a lot of the phasing, they were doing work activities off the road, grading, bringing in dirt, building the second part of the road off to the side of the existing facility. So none of the hazards were really in the way of the motorist, except for when they had heavy deliveries of dirt and other materials that had to slow down and come off the road. So in those segments, what we did is we broke it up into several zones using semi-permanent variable speed limit signs. Those are shown with the black rectangles and white numbers. And then we also used 2 of the trailer variable speed limit signs. Those are shown in the bottom graphic in the white rectangles with black numbers. Now, there was one section where we used static signs for the whole project, and that was in a detour section because that detour did require a little bit of geometry change on the existing facility, and that stayed throughout the situation. Otherwise, before we implemented the variable speed limit signs, the whole 9-mile project was reduced 60 miles an hour because of, on a daily basis and in different situations, there was this hauling or this access egress problem. But what we did when we installed the variable speed limit signs in the after condition is broke it up into segments. And so maybe if you were going from, say, left to right on the screen, segments, the south one from sign 3 to 4 may be 70 miles an hour, but another segment may be down to 60 miles an hour. And the inspector could change those very dynamically on a daily basis. Now, what we found, which wasn't surprising because we were just using signs, they just happened to be variable speed limit signs instead of static regulatory signs, is there was no practical difference in the mean speeds or the percent exceeding the speed limit or the speed variance. So while we might have anticipated a slight change in those if people realized that we were changing the speeds dynamically and maybe trusted the system more, it didn't show up in the numbers. But we also didn't see that the variable speed limits negatively impacted operations. And the inspector and the contractor on the project really loved this situation because they were able to change those speed limits in just the localized area that they needed that speed reduced. We also did a bunch of motorist surveys. This 9-mile project was bounded on both ends by towns, and a lot of the traffic on the road would go between the 2 towns on a daily basis. And so we set up some locations in those towns where we did motorist surveys and asked people about the variable speed limit signs. About 84% had seen the signs in action. Almost all of them actually thought or knew that the speed limit changed. They had seen the signs and they realized that it changed for different conditions. And shown here on the slide are some different conditions that they mentioned that the speed limits were actively changing for. About 88% thought they were effective at reducing speeds and effective at keeping up with conditions in the work zone. And all of them realized that this was still a regulatory speed limit. Just because it was a dynamic sign didn't remove the regulatory nature of the sign. And overall, the public understood the signs. And the public opinion I mentioned earlier about under the negative consequences, the public realized the DOT was actively working to make sure that the work zones matched conditions and they weren't reduced when it was unnecessary. So now we come to the big question. Do drivers voluntarily slow down? A lot of people may think that drivers don't slow down, especially a lot of workers. When you're standing out on a road and cars are going by you very fast, even at 5 miles an hour, you think that everybody is really flying by and there's a safety concern. So we wanted to go out and do some studies to decide whether people actually voluntarily slow down in work zones. So this was similar or done on the same project as the previous two evaluations I discussed. We went to 23 different work zones in Texas. Some were on 2-lane roadways. Others were on 4-lane roadways, some divided, some undivided. We also had a variety of speed limit reductions for the work zones. As I mentioned earlier, 10 is typically the max because of the language of the manual and uniform traffic control devices. But in some cases, engineering judgment had been used in Texas to reduce that speed limit by 15 miles an hour, mainly due to some crash history problems. But there was also some that only used a 5-mile-an-hour reduction. Now, we measured spot speeds at various locations throughout the work zones. We would get that upstream of the location of the work zone to see how people were traveling in free flow. We took measurements right after the reduced speed limit sign, as well as at a variety of locations, maybe next to a lane closure, next to work activity, next to a temporary crossover, anything that we considered a hazard that may warrant the speed limit reduction in the work zone. So I just want to step through a few of the findings from that project. First of all, I'd like you to note that the normal operating speeds on these facilities that I'm talking about typically ranged 5 to 10 miles an hour over the existing speed limit. So you have to remember all these people are already over the existing posted speed limit. So we'll see here in a minute how that affects our results. So here we have just the work zone speed limit sign. Okay, these were locations where you're coming, you've maybe seen some of the contractor signs, and all of a sudden, boom, here we go, we're having a reduced speed limit. But unfortunately, a lot of these, because of the way that the project was laid out, the work zone itself or the work activity or lane closure was not necessarily readily apparent, maybe due to horizontal curvature, vertical curvature, or just the fact that the lane closure was several 1,000 feet still downstream. So basically what the motorist is seeing at this point is just a work zone reduced speed limit sign. And what we see from these results is that the speed, change in speed ranged from a decrease of 3 miles an hour to an increase of 7 miles an hour. Now, we did consider the increase of 7 miles an hour to be an anomaly, and if we take that one out, most of the decreases ranged from 0 to 6 miles an hour. It's interesting to note, though, that the resulting operating speeds ranged between 70 and 76 miles an hour. So even though we did get, on average, a 3-mile-an-hour drop or decrease in speeds, because, again, the individuals were traveling over the existing speed limit, it really didn't make an impact and definitely did not bring the speeds into the area of 60 miles an hour, which was the work zone speed limit. Now, we had some lane encroachment situations in a couple of our work zones on 2-lane roads where we had pavement edge drop-offs, some traffic control devices right up against the road, workers and equipment very close to the road. And what I want to point out here is we had 2 different kinds of sites, some with a little bit lower operating speed than others, but both of them had a 10-mile-an-hour reduction. Now, it's interesting to note that at the locations where we had a higher operating speed initially, we did see a larger decrease of about 5 miles an hour. And it is also interesting that when we look at the decreases in speed, they yielded similar normal operating speeds. So we have a couple of sites where we had 60 miles an hour originally, which went down to 50, where we got them traveling about 60. Then the other one, we got them traveling about 65. Again, you will note that these are still not necessarily in compliance with the work zone speed limits, but people were decreasing their speed. Several of our work zones that we visited involved a lane closure leading into a temporary crossover that would take one side of a divided facility, bring it down to one lane, cross them over into the adjacent side, and have those 2 directions of traffic flow separated by a concrete barrier. Now, again, we had a couple of different situations of what the normal posted speed limit was versus the speed limit reduction, and we see the same trend here. Where we have higher normal operating speeds, drivers voluntarily tended to decrease their speed more than at locations where the existing operating speed was lower. Again, we'd see that overall, though, amongst all the sites, they typically are running or end up running, once they've decreased their speed, about the same speed limit, between 64 and 69 miles an hour. So again, these are voluntary. These are not places with law enforcement. These are not places with any other speed management technique. These are just how people adapted their speed going through these different work zone situations. We also had a site where on a few days we had a work activity immediately in an adjacent lane, and other days where this was not occurring. And I wanted to point out that there is a difference in how people reacted to those situations. When there was not a work activity located near the lane, we only saw about a 2-mile-an-hour decrease. But when we had the workers, large trucks, they had some bridge pier beams on these large trucks, we see that they decreased their speed by about 7 miles an hour. So again, people are changing their speed. The issue is whether or not they're changing it enough to get it down to the work zone speed limit that we have posted. The last one I want to briefly talk about is unexpected conditions. Again, we have some of those with access and egress points into work zones. At some of those locations, we saw about a 6-mile-an-hour voluntary reduction in speeds, resulting in people going about 71 miles an hour, which again, the 6-mile-an-hour reduction just really brought them into compliance with the existing speed limit, not necessarily the work zone speed limit. And then we did have one site where we had enforcement. This was one of our locations where there was some crash history issues when the work zone initially went up. It was a divided 4-lane facility, but it was not limited access. So there was all kinds of business driveways as well as residential driveways that came in this town. And when they did a crossover and they moved traffic to one side, you actually turned it into a 2-lane, 1 lane in each direction kind of operation. And people were forgetting when they left these driveways, they needed to look left and right now, not just one or the other before they crossed. And so the local sheriff was actively involved in enforcement. They ran enforcement 24/7, every day of the week, and that yielded what we see here, which is upwards, 15 mile an hour or more decrease in speeds, and actually brought the speeds that people were traveling underneath the work zone speed limit. So this does start to show us what enforcement can do if we are active and really have it going that we can. So one thing I want to point out before I move on to the next is that drivers do slow down. We just don't know that they're slowing down maybe to what we have posted the work zone speed limit. So overall, what we found from this study was if we just put a work zone speed limit sign up and we're not matching conditions or there's not a condition readily apparent right where that sign is, people really are not going to change their speeds very much. They may decrease slightly, but really they're going to wait to change that speed until they encounter one of those situations, some of those ones I showed later on, like the lane closures, temporary crossovers. Now, we also saw there was fairly consistent speed reductions across all of the different speed limit reductions. So we had 5, 10, and 15 mile an hour work zone speed limit reductions. And basically, people reduced their speed 3 miles an hour no matter which one of those was posted. So that's interesting as well. And then again, I just want to reiterate that we had some sites that I really didn't get into today, but that they left their signs up 24/7, even though the work was not necessarily occurring anymore. There was not a hazard out there, and that really increased noncompliance. Nobody was paying attention to those signs, and again, that can really lead to credibility issues, not only with your speed limit, but any work zone device, and we don't want that to happen. We want people to trust the signs we put out there and know that they're important for them to pay attention to. So drivers do decrease their speed. Unfortunately, because they're going so fast to begin with, we tend to not get them down maybe where we had hoped or want them to be with our reduced speed limits. Now, I think this kind of comes into two parts. One, we need to be looking at how we are implementing the reduced speed limits. Is that reduction of 10 miles an hour really what I need then? They're driving through the situation at a higher speed. Am I matching well what I expect the risk and the need for the reduced speed limit to be with what people really can drive and what the expectations of the motorists are? Now that said, there are things that are not apparent to motorists that do need a reduced speed limit that we want them to actually be going the speed we've posted because it's important. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. That's really where law enforcement comes in, and then other where you may match some different speed techniques to try to get those reductions in. So again, drivers decrease their speed. It's highly dependent on the normal operating speed of your roadway and the imposing nature of the situation. But also, as we saw with my last point, was enforcement does start to get us where we need to be if there's really a situation where we want those speeds down to increase safety. Now, voluntary speed reductions, they're typically going to be less than 10 miles an hour. So to enforcement, again, this typically reduces speeds in the immediate vicinity. So if you have a circulating or a patrol that's actively giving tickets in an area, that's going to be apparent to motorists. They're going to see that police officer, and that's going to reduce speeds in the immediate vicinity. So you want to make sure your law enforcement is positioned where you really want that speed limit reduction. Now, we said that they can yield about a 15-mile-an-hour decrease. That's on average. The one instance I showed you before was a little bit more. We all know how those vary from site to site depending on the work zone conditions and the location. And also, what happens with law enforcement is we can bring those speeds into reasonable compliance with our reduced work zone speed limit. Again, I want to reiterate that if you have issues with crashes or let's say like access egress, things that are not readily apparent to the motorist as why they need to slow down, that would be the perfect place for you to try to use active enforcement because that is what they're going to see then and that will have them slowing down. So what's some other options if we obviously not every work zone we have can have active enforcement? I wanted to briefly talk a little bit about automated speed enforcement. To some that may be a bad word, to others we're looking to it to really maybe help us in the speed management area. We are developing a fact sheet as part of the Work Zone Safety Grant project right now, and that will be available on the clearinghouse shortly, and I'll show you where you can get that a little bit later at the end of the presentation. So basically, what is automated speed enforcement? For those of you that may not know how it works, there's electronic identification. Some people use radar, others use LiDAR, but basically we determine that a vehicle is traveling over a predefined speed threshold. A camera then captures the vehicle. Most of the time it's a back license plate. In some instances, depending on laws, it could even capture the driver's face. And it's embedded typically with a date, time, location, and speed. And then the registered owner, after the camera has captured it, usually there's some process that it goes through of review by a police officer. The registered owner is identified and sent the citation. Now, a couple of places that we have really been successfully using automated speed enforcement is Illinois, Washington, and Maryland. And when the fact sheet comes out, there's going to be a lot more details in that fact sheet about each of those locations that I'm not going to go into today. I briefly want to show you some of their evaluation results. So in Illinois, they had, on average, a 3 to 8 mile an hour decrease in average speeds in locations where they were using automated speed enforcement. They also saw a 5 to 54% decrease in the percent of vehicles exceeding the speed limit. In Washington, the data is a little bit more anecdotal right now, but they do feel like they are getting lower speeds in their work zones and that there's a decrease in the number of vehicles exceeding 70 miles an hour. In Maryland, they were seeing a 54% decrease in the number of vehicles exceeding the speed limit by 10 miles an hour, and they were reducing speed disparity or that speed variance that we talked about earlier. So hopefully that is working into a reduction of crashes as well. Considerations. If you're interested in implementing or starting to talk with some of your key stakeholders about automated speed enforcement, is that specific legislation is required. This legislation generally says when and where automated speed enforcement can be used, different types of facilities for different speeds. It also talks about whether you need to have supervision exactly by a police officer or review by a police officer, whether or not signs need to be posted. In the 3 states I mentioned earlier, they're all required to post signs that say there is speed automated enforcement in the area. Some of them also must display dynamic speed trailers to kind of tell you ahead of time you're going this fast and downstream we may take your picture. And then there's also, in some legislation in those states, they require workers to be present, but in others they don't. You need to make sure, if you're starting this effort, to coordinate with law enforcement and court systems. They can be your biggest proponent, or they can be your biggest opponent. So you need to get them on board to start with, explain it, explain how it's going to be beneficial to both parties, and how it's going to help with safety. And when you start considering deployment locations, we need to consider a few things. Basically, you need to look at your work zone safety considerations and select them based on that. Also, you want to put automated speed enforcement in locations that are not going to have congestion and where speeds are fairly high. You want to position it near the work area just as we would active enforcement, because where that enforcement is where the speed reductions are going to occur. And when you're designing or talking about how to implement the system, especially at a certain work zone, you want to make sure that you consider the safety of your police, workers, and the road user, and set the system up in a safe location. You also might consider including a comprehensive public outreach program so that people know that you're going to begin using automated speed enforcement, why you've chosen to go this route, and what the positive benefits are for the road user, as well as worker safety and everything else. A few additional considerations include a development of a process for implementing and maintaining the system. You need to consider how you're going to administer the automated speed enforcement program, and if you'd like to do an evaluation, how you're going to do that. Another issue that comes up sometimes in legislation or as you're talking with your police and the court system is, based on the laws in your state, how will the violation be viewed? Is it an administrative infraction, or is it actually a moving violation? And this impacts how sometimes the ticket can be issued, as well as the monetary amounts that are associated with that ticket or citation. Again, communication and coordination with key stakeholders from the beginning throughout implementation and existing as you have the program is key to a successful deployment. Here on this slide, I've listed some other speed management techniques. Obviously, again, we've talked about enforcement and then automated speed enforcement, but those are not always available for every work zone. So here we list a few that range from their speed reductions of about 0 miles an hour to 10 miles an hour. And this is a good snapshot. These potential speed reductions were taken from a variety of publications where people have used these. Again, every work zone is different, so there is a range. Pretty much the most effective supplementary or other speed management technique is your speed display trailers. But you need to remember that sometimes they lose effect if you leave them in the same place over time, especially if they are not paired with enforcement. People start to acknowledge that it's just a sign, it's telling me my speed, and there's no consequence for me not following that speed. So the last part I want to discuss today has to do with a decision tool that is part of the guidance document that, again, I will show you where you can access that on my last slide in the presentation. We developed this tool based on the principles I've discussed with you today, so let me walk you quickly through that. First of all, you need to make a decision if a reduced work zone speed limit is even needed. Okay? Some of the times they may not be. If we're working off the roadway, there's no real restrictive feature or work zone condition that increases risk to motorists, then we may answer no. We don't really need a reduced speed limit. But if we feel that workers are in danger because they're not behind positive protection, or there is some feature that is increasing the risk to motorists, then we need to consider reducing the speed limit. Once we've decided we need to reduce the speed limit, we need to acknowledge whether there's going to be times that that speed limit's not going to match conditions. Again, if at the end of the day, when your workers and equipment leave the site, the work condition does not necessitate or warrant a reduced speed limit, we need to be removing or covering those signs. So you have to consider that in your plan, because that is going to change your work, how often you have to do that. Do you want to consider some of those innovative devices I mentioned earlier? And obviously, again, you need to check with your state laws, standards, and regulations before implementing those. Now, if there is something out there like a lane closure or temporary crossover that's going to be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, then we would not need to necessarily frequently change those conditions. Another question you need to ask yourself is, will the drivers voluntarily reduce their speed limit to within 5 miles an hour of my work zone speed limit? Okay, I showed you some snapshots of some data from Texas to give you an idea about how people do voluntarily reduce their speed limit. I encourage you to use that data, and I'll actually give you a place online where you can go get that whole report if you would like to look at that at a later date. So if we think that people are going to voluntarily reduce their speed limit within 5 miles an hour, we really don't need any speed reduction strategies. But if not, that's when we have to start considering speed management techniques. Again, law enforcement is going to be the one that typically reduces speeds the most and brings people into compliance with work zone speed limits. But they're not always available or feasible for every work zone. So we can use driver feedback devices like speed display trailers or other perceptual methods that I mentioned in that table and that you can get more information on in some other documents. Now, the last question you need to ask yourself is, once I've looked at these potential speed management techniques, is with the voluntary speed reduction from the driver and my speed management technique, am I still bringing speeds into about 5 miles an hour of my reduced posted work zone speed limit? If the answer is yes, then take your strategy, implement it, and good luck to getting those speeds reduced. Monitor it so that you know how effective it is and you know how your decisions are working so that you may feed back into the process for another work zone. But if not, you may want to reconsider the magnitude of your speed limit reduction. Remember, I mentioned earlier that part of the pie or the piece of the puzzle is we have to make sure we're choosing a reduced work zone speed limit that adequately matches the conditions to begin with. Lack of, I guess in a way, enforcement could bring them into compliance, but we don't want to also be enforcing an unrealistic speed limit for conditions as well. So that's a key. That would feed back in, and you'd need to go back and consider, do I really need a 10-mile-an-hour reduction? Would a 5 be more applicable? And think about that using engineering judgment. And I know a lot of states have standards that help you think about what those speed reductions need to be. And if you're looking for a new, innovative way, the Texas Department of Transportation has recently updated the way they do it, and they specify based on facility type, work that's going on, existed posted speed limit, whether or not you should do a 5 or 10, and then in some cases, they even allow for higher special cases are listed. So if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me. My information is going to be on the next slide. Okay, so as I promised, my contact information, if you'd like to get a hold of me to discuss any of these points at a later date or obtain the Texas kind of standards, the revised policy on how they reduce work zone speed limits. The first link there shows you the Work Zone Safety Grant Program area of the Clearinghouse website. That is where you can get the guidelines that I kind of pulled this information from today. That's an existing document out there. The automated speed enforcement document will be out there at a later date, hopefully very soon, as well as a new module that will be available for the Roadway Safety Plus Advanced course. It's going to be a speed module that takes these concepts as well and lets you utilize them to train others or to go through it again. And last but not least, there is a link here for the report where I pulled all of the speed data that I talked about specifically from Texas today. But if you'd like to get a hold of that, it's online and available for you to review it. And that's all I have, Brad.
Very good. Thanks, Melissa. I think that was very informative. We do have a few questions that have come in for you.
Okay.
First of all, at one point in your presentation, you stated that 5 miles an hour may be the only reduction allowed. Can you explain why that would be 5 instead of 10 or something along those lines?
Okay, yes, I can. What we developed and how we used the data that I showed earlier from Texas is basically we said, okay, if we have a lower initial operating speed or posted speed limit, say 60 or 55, really to get people going the speed we want, we may only need to drop at 5 miles an hour versus dropping at 10. So if we drop at 10 miles an hour, it's not really going to match conditions. That speed limit is too low, and people with your voluntary speed reduction and any speed management technique are just not ever going to get within that sign. So you can post a sign but realistically, you're not achieving those speeds. So you may have a false sense of security out there from your contractor or your workers expecting people to go that speed. It's never going to mesh. So what we went back and did is said in certain situations on different facilities, and depending on the existing operating speeds of the roadway, we may only want a 5 here, but if it's a 70-mile-an-hour roadway with the same condition, we want a 10 because it brought those in line across the board. So that was kind of where I was trying to lead with that.
Good. Well, kind of a related question is what are some of the factors one considers in an engineering study when determining how many miles per hour to reduce the speed limit?
A lot of things were done. The most prevalent document was back from the 1990s, so it's a little dated with today, especially with some of the states going back to higher posted speed limits, so we have our normal operating speeds probably higher than when that study was done. Used basically some of the items I had today. Lane encroachment was one, narrow lanes, barrier, all of those kind of things are in a flow chart developed by some researchers back in the 90s. Now, that's also kind of where the maximum 10-mile-an-hour speed limit recommendation from the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices came from. And while they mentioned in that research report that you could just reduce it 5, their number, based on some crashes, was a typical 10-mile-an-hour reduced speed limit for a variety of work zone features. And that's where a lot of states have developed their standards from, and the existing standards are. We are just thinking maybe it's time to revisit some of those, and that's what we did in Texas, because they were pretty much using that, and kind of go back in and look at how people in your state are reacting and running through these situations, still trying to balance the need for safety and realizing that people don't always know what's best, so you have to balance that. So it's not necessarily an easy question to answer.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Our next question comes in. It says, have you studied the effects of the your speed signs that employ radar to show people how fast they're going versus the established work zone speed limit?
I have not personally, but there has been some other research at TTI and several across the nation just looking at the speed display trailers, even in conjunction with the work zone reduced speed limit or vice versa. And that 2, I think it was 2 to 10, is pretty consistent. 10 is on the large side. I think a lot of them may even only be seeing 5 to 6 mile-an-hour reductions. And again, that speed limit decrease will stop being, or that device will stop being as effective if it's not enforced and it's left out there for a long time. So your best bet through all those studies is to definitely move your device around. You know, that lets people know you're out there doing something with the device. And also, if you compare it with some kind of enforcement, even if it's not all the time, but occasionally, keeps them on their toes, and they realize that you really are using that device to try to reduce their speed.
Great. Last question I have now, unless more come forward, is you mentioned that probably the most effective way to reduce speeds is using law enforcement. Just to summarize some of the strategies that you discussed earlier, can you tell us what are the most effective strategies that are being used based on your research and your experience?
Okay, I would definitely say law enforcement is the most effective, and I think anyone you talk to will tell you that. Just because, and you can use law enforcement in a variety of ways, and there is going to be some additional guidelines brought forth on the Work Zone Clearinghouse specifically targeted on use of law enforcement that gets into different ways they're used and then what the speed reductions are expected from those. So please keep posted on that as well. But overall, because of their presence and people seeing it, when people have an increased risk and can see that, they're going to slow down because they just do not want to get a ticket, and it's perceived that way. The next, I would say the next best one is probably in tandem if your state can get to where they can use automated speed enforcement. We were seeing, 3 to 8 mile-an-hour reductions. That's another good one. And again, the speed display trailers out of the whole table is probably the best because it's 2 to 10 miles an hour. And they're relatively inexpensive to use. A lot of cities, different DOTs already have them. And you can use them in a lot of places, not just work zone speed limits. You can use them in school zones. So they're a device that can really be shared amongst agencies and across different safety considerations, not just for work zones. So I think for an inexpensive device and a readily available device, your speed display trailers, just keep in mind that you do need to move them around. You can't just put them out there, leave them out there for 3 months, then you've kind of lost your effectiveness.
All right. And our last question is, will your slides be available to share after the show today? I think I can answer that.
Okay.
That later today, this entire webinar will be posted, as well as the slides, and they will be available through the Work Zone Safety Information Clearinghouse. And just to add a little further information, you've heard Melissa mention several times the products that have been developed through the Federal Highway Work Zone Training Grant Program. All of these products are now available on the Work Zone Clearinghouse. If you go to the homepage at workzonesafety.org, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner a box, and amongst those listed says FHWA Work Zone Training Products. There are a number of guidance documents, training programs, all have been developed by a variety of organizations that are well known for their expertise. And all this information is available for free or at a very low cost and in some very limited conditions. So please take advantage of that and go to the Work Zone Clearinghouse. Likewise, I'd like to remind you that this is our last webinar for 2011, but we have many more planned for 2012 and some pretty exciting programs. Probably most notable amongst these is our 2012 Global Innovations in Roadway Work Zone Safety. That conference, a large international conference, is actually virtual, so it'll be coming to your desktop. You can attend, join us, and walk to exhibits, go to different sessions, as if you were at a live conference, but all this will be virtual. And this will take place the last week of April in conjunction with Work Zone Awareness Week. So we hope you'll take advantage of that conference and look to the Work Zone Clearinghouse for more information on that. We have a variety of topics dealing with things, as Melissa has spoken about today, automated speed enforcement, ITS, a lot of strategies for dealing with workers on foot. Anyway, please plan to join that. And that will also be paired with the conference put on by ARTBA's Transportation Development Foundation, looking at a global safe road, so a more wide variety of safety and roadways and the construction environment. So we thank you for joining us today. Again, remember, you can get professional development hours with that information available on the Clearinghouse, and we look forward to seeing you in 2012. Take care.